"Go slow. It hurts," she whispered, her breath catching in the cold night air. The words trembled out of her like a prayer she didn't mean to speak. He froze the cowboy with the scar beneath his jaw, his hands steady from a lifetime of violence. For a moment, the silence between them was louder than any gunfire he'd ever known. Rain began to fall, slow and heavy, tracing the dirt on her face. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him shifted, the kind of ache a man carries when he's found something worth saving. "I'm right here," he said softly, voice rough as gravel. "Ain't no hurt gonna touch you again." Her eyes met his, wide with fear and something dangerously close to hope. The wind moved through the grass like a whisper of all they'd lost, and all that might still be found. Because on this broken stretch of frontier, love was a wound, and the only thing stronger than pain was the promise he made to stop it. The wind came down off the ridge, slow and bitter, carrying the scent of wet sage and old sorrow. Sarah Bennett stood by the grave, her black veil pressed against her face, her hands buried deep in the raw earth she just packed over her husband's coffin. The shovel leaned against the fence post, its handle slick from her grip. The town folk had gone hours ago. They said their soft words, left their flowers, and rode home before the sky broke. Only Sarah stayed. Only she still listened for a voice that would never answer. By dusk, the first drops of rain began to fall. She drew her shawl tighter and whispered the same words she'd said every night since the shooting. "You didn't deserve to die, Thomas. Not for me." The ground gave no reply. A distant rhythm broke through the hush hooves. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the mist like a heartbeat growing nearer. Sarah turned, every muscle tensing beneath her mourning dress. A lone rider came into view, his coat dark with dust and rain, the brim of his hat low over his eyes. He stopped a few yards away, dismounted without hurry, and let the horse breathe steam into the cooling air. He studied the small grave, then the woman beside it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep, quiet, carrying the rasp of road dust and distance. "You shouldn't be alone out here." Sarah's fingers tightened around the wooden cross. "Been alone a long time," she said without looking up. He nodded once, as if he understood too well. "Still, this land don't take kindly to the unguarded. Wolves, men both hunt when the light goes." He brushed a tear with the back of her hand. "If you're looking to scare me, mister, you're too late." "I'm not looking to scare you," he answered. "Just reckon you should come off this hill before dark." The way he spoke carried no threat, only worn patience, the kind a man learns after burying more than one mistake. She glanced toward the horizon, where the last streak of sunlight bled into gray. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Carson," he said. "Luke Carson." The name meant nothing to her then. Later, it would mean everything. By the time she gathered her basket and turned toward the trail, thunder rolled low across the valley. The stranger walked beside her horse, silent except for the soft jingle of his spurs. The path was narrow and rough, the mud pulling at her boots. More than once she stumbled, and each time his hand caught her elbow firm, careful, respectful. They reached the split where the trail forked toward town. Sarah stopped. "You can leave me here," she said. "Black Hollow's 2 miles down." He looked toward the darkening sky. "Ain't safe ridden it alone. I've ridden it before." He studied her face, the defiance there, the grief beneath it, then sighed. "Suit yourself." He turned to go. Something in her chest twisted. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way he didn't insist. Maybe it was how the quiet felt heavier once he stepped away. "Mr. Carson," she called softly. He paused. "If you're headed that way too, we might as well ride together." His eyes met hers, gray as the coming storm. "All right then." They rode side by side as night settled over the prairie, their horses' hooves thudding against the wet ground. Lightning flashed across the plains, throwing shadows long and sharp. When they reached the edge of town, Luke nodded toward the livery. You got someplace to stay. Sarah hesitated. The house is mine still, at least until the bank decides otherwise. He gave a small nod. Then I'll see you safe to your door. She wanted to argue, to keep the wall between them solid, but the memory of that gunshot night lingered too close. So she let him ride beside her through the rain. At her gate, she dismounted and faced him. "Thank you, Mr. Carson." He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Lightning cracked again, closer this time. He looked toward the hills, the reflex of a man who listens for trouble. "You might want to keep that door locked tonight." "Is there reason I should?" His jaw tightened. "Not yet." Then he turned, mounted, and rode off into the darkness. Sarah watched until the sound of hooves faded. Only, when the night grew still, did she whisper to the empty road, "Go slow. It hurts." But the wind carried her words away, and she was alone again. By morning, she'd learned that the man who rode into her grief carried a past darker than the storm itself, and that her life, once buried beside her husband's grave, was not finished yet. The storm broke before dawn. Sarah woke to the sound of rain clawing at the window, the kind that turned roads into rivers and silence into something almost holy. The small house felt emptier than ever, the scent of wet earth seeping through the cracks, the creak of timbers settling against the wind. She moved through the rooms quietly, her hand brushing the chair where her husband once sat. Everything was still in its place, but nothing felt like hers anymore. The fire had burned out hours ago, leaving only gray ash and memory. She pulled on her cloak and stepped outside. The world was washed in silver light, and the mud clung to her boots as if it meant to hold her there. She fastened the saddle straps on her horse, whispering to calm him. Then she saw him. Luke Carson stood by the fence, rain dripping from his hat, a quiet figure against the endless plain. He'd been waiting. "You plan to ride today?" he asked. "I can't stay," she replied. "If I don't reach the bank before noon, they'll take what's left." He nodded once. "Then I'll ride with you." "I didn't ask you to." He met her eyes, steady and calm. "Didn't say you had to." Without another word, he swung into the saddle and turned his horse toward the trail. She followed. The road out of town wound through open prairie, where the grass bowed under the weight of rain. For miles, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rhythm of hooves and the steady breath of their horses. Now and then, she glanced at him the way he rode straight, backed, alert, his gaze always scanning the horizon. There was something about him that carried danger, but also a strange kind of peace, as if he'd already faced worse than whatever waited out here. By midday, the storm eased to drizzle. The sky hung low, gray and swollen, and the world smelled of wet sage and clay. Sarah broke the silence first. "You from these parts?" "No," he said. "Too many ghosts in this country for me to call it home." "Then why stay?" He looked out toward the hills. Sometimes a man rides far enough, he forgets what he was running from. Other times, he just gets tired of running. She studied his face, the faint scar beneath his jaw, the eyes that never stopped searching. "You don't seem the kind who tires easy." "Everyone tires eventually." They rode on. By afternoon, the sun broke through in brief shards of light. Steam rose from the grass, and the air grew heavy with the smell of rain. Damp dust. Sarah's dress clung to her, the fabric streaked with mud. "You got family in Black Hollow?" Luke asked after a while. "No," she said quietly. "My husband and I came from Missouri. Thought we'd start fresh. The land didn't agree." He nodded, not pressing her further. They rode another mile before he spoke again. "You said the bank's after your place." "Yes, Thomas borrowed against the land. Drought took the crop, and then," she hesitated, "after he died, there was nothing left to pay with." Luke's jaw worked slowly. "They'll come for the deed, then the house." "I know." He looked at her then, something unspoken in his eyes. "You ain't giving up, are you?" She straightened her shoulders. "I buried a man last week. Giving up's not what I came out here to do." For the first time, a small flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Good." By late afternoon, the trail narrowed between two ridges. The air changed quieter, heavier. Luke slowed his horse. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer. His eyes traced the rocks above them, the brush along the slope. The wind had stilled, the kind of silence that meant something was waiting. A moment later, he said softly, "Keep your reins steady. Don't stop." Her pulse quickened. Why? He didn't have to explain. From the ridge came the echo of movement, a hoarse snort, the faint jingle of metal. Outlaws. Luke's hand slipped to the rifle strapped behind his saddle. He didn't raise it, not yet, just kept riding with a stillness that made the air feel brittle. They rounded a bend and two men stepped onto the trail. Mutts, splattered, rough, faced, guns low at their sides. Afternoon. One of them called. "Fine day for travelin'." Luke's tone stayed even. "Depends who's asking." The taller man smiled without warmth. "Name's Klein. Used to do business with a Mr. Bennett. Guessing this here's his widow." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What business?" "Debt collection." The man's grin widened. "See, your husband owed us more than the bank. We come to settle what's left." Luke's voice turned hard. "She owes no one." Klein spat into the mud. "That's so. Then maybe she pays in kind. Ain't every day a woman rides alone." The second man laughed under his breath. Luke dismounted slowly, boots sinking in the wet earth. "You boys best find another road." Klein's grin faltered. "You mean to stop us?" Luke's eyes narrowed, gray as slate. "I don't mean to. I will." A beat of silence, then everything happened at once. Klein drew first. Thunder cracked. Luke's gun flashed once, clean and sure. The outlaw dropped where he stood. The second man fled, stumbling through the brush. Luke didn't chase him. He turned instead to Sarah, his face unreadable. "You all right?" She nodded, though her knees shook. He holstered his gun, voice low. "You ride on ahead. I'll see if there's more coming. Mr. Carson." He met her gaze. "Steady. Go. Now." Reluctantly, she obeyed. Her horse kicked through the mud, hooves splashing in rhythm with her racing heart. She didn't look back, not until the trail curved high enough to see the valley below. Luke was there, still as stone beside the fallen man, hat tipped low. The rain had stopped, but the thunder lingered somewhere far off, a promise it would return. By the time she reached the edge of Black Hollow, her hands still trembled on the reins. She didn't know whether to fear the men chasing her debts, or the stranger who'd just killed to keep her safe. And somewhere behind her, Luke Carson wiped the rain from his gun barrel and whispered to no one at all, "Not again." The wind carried the words away, but the weight of them stayed. By morning, they would both learn that danger had only begun to ride their trail. By nightfall, the rain had turned cold again. Sarah's horse moved slow beneath her, its sides slick with mud and exhaustion. The town lights of Black Hollow flickered faint in the distance, but she didn't head toward them. Her pulse still beat with the echo of gunfire, and she wanted no eyes on her, not the sheriff's, not the banker's, not anyone's. She followed the creek north until she saw the outline of an old homestead, roof half, gaved chimney leaning. Smoke hadn't risen from that place in years. It would do. Shelter, at least, from the storm and the world. She led the horse into the barn, gave it the last handful of feed she carried, and stepped inside the house. Dust hung in the air. Broken glass glittered where moonlight touched it. Still, there was a hearth and a few logs stacked by the door. She struck a match, cupped it, and waited until flame caught. The firelight stretched long across the walls, and for the first time since she buried her husband, the silence felt different, not lonely, just fragile. A knock came. 3 slow raps. Her heart stopped. Before she could move, a voice outside said quietly, "It's me." She opened the door to find Luke Carson standing there, rain dripping from his hat brim. His coat was torn at the shoulder, mud streaked up one sleeve. His eyes were tired, but steady. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. He stepped inside. "Wasn't about following. Just didn't fancy you sleeping out here alone with that shot still echoing." She studied him, then nodded once. "You're bleeding." He glanced at his shoulder. Just a graze. Sit." He didn't argue. He sank onto the edge of a chair while she fetched what little she had, a strip of linen, a bowl of water. When she pressed the cloth to his wound, he winced, then held still. "You didn't have to kill him," she said quietly. He met her eyes. "You think he'd have stopped if I didn't?" She looked away. The fire popped between them, throwing shadows across his jaw. "You've done this before." He said nothing. That was answer enough. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the shutters. Sarah bound the wound tight, her fingers trembling more from closeness than fear. When she finished, she sat back, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For still looking at me." The words caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "Most folks, once they see what I'm capable of, they turn away." She studied his face, the lines carved deep by weather and regret. "You did what you had to do." He shook his head. "That's what I tell myself too. Doesn't make it right." The fire burned lower. The house creaked in the wind. Sarah leaned back, arms folded tight. "You saved my life." He gave a small, humorless smile. "And took another to do it." "Then we're even," she said. He looked at her, confused. "You saved one life, lost one. The world's balance stays." He wanted to argue, but her tone left no room. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'll stay near the ridge till morning. Make sure no one followed." "Luke," she said softly, "stay inside. You're bleeding through that bandage." He hesitated. "Ain't proper." She gave a tired half-smile. "Proper left this place a long time ago." He stayed. The wind howled through the night, rattling the old windows. Every few hours he got up, checked the door, the shutters, the distant dark. She watched him in the flicker of the fire, the way he moved, careful but ready, like a man who slept beside danger more than peace. Near dawn, she drifted into uneasy sleep. When she woke, Luke was still there, sitting by the window, his rifle across his knees. "Get some rest," she murmured. He shook his head. "Sun's rising. Trouble rides with daylight." "What kind of trouble?" He didn't answer right away. He was staring out at the horizon, two small dots moving fast across the ridge. "Company," he said. Sarah joined him at the window. "Who?" "The ones who ran last night." Fear tightened in her chest. "What do we do?" He stood, checking his rifle. "We hold the line. I'm not leaving." His eyes softened, but his tone stayed firm. "No, you stay behind that hearth. Keep your head down. If they want the deed, they can talk to me first." Minutes later, the riders came into view, 3 of them this time, their coats dark, faces hidden under wide hats. The sound of their horses echoed like thunder rolling low. Luke stepped outside, coat flapping in the wind. Sarah watched from the doorway, one hand pressed against her throat. The lead rider called out, "Carson, didn't figure to find you playing guardian to widows." Luke's jaw clenched. "Then you figured wrong." The man laughed. "Heard you hung up your gun. Guess you couldn't stay out of the killing long." Luke's hand hovered near his holster. "You can ride on, or you can stay and see how much I've forgotten." The man's grin faded. "We'll take what she owes. That's all. She owes nothing. She owes blood." Sarah's breath caught. The outlaws drew their guns. Luke moved first. A flash, a shout, the sharp crack of return fire. One outlaw fell. Another shot splintered the post beside Sarah's head. She ducked back, heart pounding. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw Luke steady, fearless, every movement measured. He fired once more, then silence. When the smoke cleared, only one man remained alive, clutching his arm, face pale. Luke walked toward him, slow. "Tell whoever sent you," he said, voice cold as iron. "This woman's debt is paid." The man nodded shakily and stumbled to his horse. Luke watched until he vanished over the ridge, then turned toward Sarah. His face was gray, his sleeve dark with blood again. She ran to him. "You're hurt." He steadied himself against the fence. "Nothing new." "Come inside," she said, half come and half plea. He followed, silent. She guided him to the chair by the fire, tore another strip from her petticoat and pressed it to the wound. When she finished, she looked at him, really looked. "Why are you doing this for me?" His eyes lifted slowly to meet hers. "Because once someone didn't." The firelight flickered between them. Neither spoke again. Outside, the dawn spread thin across the plains, soft and gray, a promise and a warning both. By morning, the homestead stood quiet again, smoke rising from its chimney. But in the hush that followed gunfire, something unseen had changed. She no longer felt alone, and he no longer felt lost. The morning broke clean after the storm. The clouds had pulled apart, leaving the prairie washed and still. A blue so deep it hurt stretched across the sky, and smoke rose thin from the cabin chimney where Sarah moved quietly, her hands busy, her thoughts restless. Luke slept in the chair by the fire, his hat pulled low, his bandaged arm resting against his chest. Every now and then he stirred, breath rough, jaw set even in sleep, a man not used to letting his guard fall. Sarah watched him for a moment longer, then turned back to her work. She mixed flour and water in a dented bowl, the motion slow and steady. It had been months since she'd baked anything. Bread had always been her husband's task. He liked the feel of it, said it reminded him of home. She caught herself smiling, then quickly wiped her hands and looked away. By the time Luke opened his eyes, the room smelled of yeast and wood smoke. He blinked at her, still caught between dreams and waking. "You're up early." "So are you," she said. He eased forward, wincing at his shoulder. "Habit, you should be resting. Can't rest when there's a roof half torn off." She turned, surprised. "You mean to fix it?" He nodded, glancing at the ceiling. "Won't hold another rain. I saw tools in the barn. I'll manage." Sarah shook her head. "Not with that arm. Been hurt worse." "You shouldn't push it." He met her eyes, calm but firm. "Ma'am, I can't sit idle while a woman's roof leaks." She hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. But if that wound opens again, I'll make you sit." The faintest trace of a smile tugged at his mouth. "Reckon you could." By midday he was on the roof, moving careful but sure, patching gaps with scavenged boards. Sarah worked below, kneading dough, glancing up every so often. The rhythm between them felt unspoken but easy, two people learning the quiet language of work and survival. When the bread came out golden and warm, she set it on the table. A soft wind slipped through the broken panes, carrying the scent through the room. "Lunch," she called. Luke climbed down slow, brushing dust from his hands. "It smells like mercy." "Just bread," she said, but her tone softened. He sat across from her. For a while, they ate in silence, just the sound of the fire and the creak of the chair beneath his weight. "This house," he said after a while, "wasn't yours, was it?" "No," she said. "We found it when we first came west. Thomas meant to fix it up, said we'd fill it with life. And now," she looked around the small, worn room. "Now it's just me and ghosts." Luke's gaze held hers a long moment. "Ghosts fade when you keep the fire lit." "Do they?" she whispered. "They do," he said, "if you let someone help you tend it." The words sat heavy between them. She looked down at her hands, flour, dusted, trembling slightly. He reached for his cup, the movement slow, deliberate. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, circling above the open plain. By late afternoon, Luke's shoulder began to bleed through the bandage. She noticed before he did a dark stain spreading beneath his sleeve. "Luke," she said sharply, "you're bleeding again." He glanced down, frowned, and started to speak. But she was already beside him, hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Sit," she said. He obeyed. She peeled back the bandage, her breath catching when she saw how deep the wound really was. "You need rest, not roof work. Rest don't build shelter," he murmured. "Neither does bleeding out." He didn't answer. She cleaned the wound carefully, the silence thick except for the faint hiss of the fire. When her hand brushed his skin, he flinched, not from pain, but something else, something that made the air between them hum. Her voice softened. "Does it hurt much?" He looked at her truly looked eyes, shadowed and searching. Not the way you mean. The words stilled her. Her hands paused, the cloth resting against his shoulder. Their faces were close, too close. For a moment, she saw the man behind the quiet, the weight he carried, the kindness buried under the gun. And he saw her not as a widow, not as someone broken, but as a woman trying to breathe again. The fire popped, breaking the moment. She stepped back quickly, cheeks flushed. "You should lie down." He nodded, voice rough. "Yes, ma'am." When night came, the cabin settled into calm. The repaired roof no longer dripped. The bread cooled on the hearth, and though neither spoke of it, something small had changed, not spoken, not yet understood, but real. Sarah sat by the window, looking out at the starlit plain. Behind her, Luke stirred in his sleep, murmuring a name she didn't know. She closed her eyes, whispering into the dark, "Go slow. It hurts." The words weren't just his now. They were hers, too. By morning, the storm would return, and with it, the first fragile thread of trust. The dawn came soft, the kind that made the world look gentler than it was. Mist rolled low across the fields, touching every blade of grass with silver. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, arms folded against the chill, watching the breath of her horse rise in thin clouds by the corral. Behind her, the cabin creaked the sound of a man waking early out of habit, not rest. Luke moved with care, though she could hear the faint wince in every step. The wound had pulled at the night, and though he'd said little, she knew pain had kept him company more than sleep had. He joined her at the door, shirt half buttoned, hat in hand. "Morning," he said, voice low, roughened by the night. "Morning," she replied. They stood in silence a moment, side by side, watching the world wake. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called long, lonely, fading into the hills. "You were talking in your sleep," she said quietly. He froze just a little. "Was I now?" "You said a name." He looked down, jaw tightening. "Best to forget it." Sarah nodded once, not pushing. The way he said it calm, but heavy, told her it belonged to a part of him he'd left buried somewhere out on the trail. After a moment, she changed the subject. "Roof held through the night. You did good work." He smiled faintly. "Glad it kept you dry." "It kept us dry," she corrected. He glanced at her then, eyes softening just a touch. "Right, us." Inside, the smell of last night's bread lingered, faint but comforting. Sarah set water to boil, while Luke gathered kindling. The rhythm between them had begun to form, quiet, careful, something unspoken filling the spaces where words used to hurt. When they sat to eat, she found herself watching him again, the way his hands moved, steady and sure, the way he seemed to carry every sound of the wilderness inside him. "You've been alone a long time," she said. He didn't deny it. "Long enough to forget how not to be." Her eyes lowered. "I know that feeling." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was gentle. Outside, the sun began to climb, warming the edge of the porch. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something close to peace settle in her chest. But peace, out here, never lasted long. By midday, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. 2 riders coming fast from the south trail, dust rising behind them, purpose in their speed. Luke's head lifted first. His body went still, hand drifting unconsciously toward where his gun used to hang. Sarah turned from the table. "You expecting company?" "No," he said, eyes narrowing. "Not the kind that knocks polite." The riders drew closer, one tall, one lean, both dressed in trail, worn dusters, the kind of men who didn't ride for neighborly visits. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Luke." He stepped toward the door, voice calm but flat. "Stay inside." "Who are they?" He didn't answer. The horses stopped a few yards from the porch. The tall man swung down first, grin sharp as a blade. "Well, I'll be damned. Luke Carson. Thought we'd buried you back in Red Hollow." Luke's face didn't change, but the muscle in his jaw twitched. "You should have kept riding, Hale." The man laughed, "Still talking like you got a say in things. You owe us, Carson. Ain't no storm nor woman gonna hide you from that." Sarah's breath caught. Luke, what's he talking about? Luke didn't turn to her. His voice dropped low, hard, inside Sarah. She hesitated just long enough to see the second man's hand brush the butt of his pistol. Luke moved, then not fast, but sure. He stepped down from the porch, shoulders squared, eyes steady. You came a long way for a ghost. You sure you want to wake him? Hale's grin faltered. The air between them went still. Then, slow and cold, the man said, You always did talk brave. Let's see if you still shoot the same. Sarah's heart hammered. Luke spoke without looking back. When I say go, you close that door and don't open it till the dust settles. Luke, go slow. He murmured, the old words soft, steady. It hurts worse when you rush. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. The next sound was steel. The kind of sound that split the peace wide open. And as the first shot cracked through the morning air, Sarah realized the quiet between storms was never meant to last. It only taught you what you stood to lose when the thunder finally came. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the morning. It mingled with the clean scent of rain, soaked wood, and the silence that followed was sharper than the shots themselves. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, fingers white against the frame. When she finally stepped out, the world looked tilted, like it hadn't quite decided whether peace or violence ruled it. Two men lay still in the dirt. Luke knelt beside one, checking the pulse he already knew wasn't there. The wind lifted the brim of his hat, revealing the strain in his jaw, the weariness deep in his eyes. You're hurt, Sarah said softly. He looked down, saw the dark stain spreading through his sleeve. It's not bad. You said that last time. He didn't answer. He just rose, holstered the revolver with a motion that felt too practiced, too familiar, as if part of him had been waiting to pick it up again. Sarah's voice trembled. They knew your name. Luke paused. Yeah. Who were they? Reminders, he said, of the man I used to be. She stared at him, her breath unsteady. And that man, is he gone? He looked out toward the horizon where the clouds were gathering again. He's trying to be. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter. Luke buried the dead without a word, his hands steady, his face unreadable. Sarah watched from the porch, the ache in her chest growing heavier with every shovelful of dirt. When he came back, his shirt clung to him, the wound reopened. She stepped forward before he could protest, guiding him inside. Sit, she ordered, softer than anger but firmer than kindness. He hesitated, then obeyed. She tore a strip of cloth, pressed it against his shoulder. You shouldn't have to do this alone. I've been alone most of my life, he said. Maybe that's the problem. He tried to smile, but it faltered before reaching his eyes. For a long while, neither spoke. Rain began to fall again, steady and rhythmic against the roof. Sarah replaced the bandage, her fingers brushing his skin, calloused, warm, trembling slightly. You're shaking. Cold, he said, though she could tell it wasn't. The storm deepened. Thunder rolled low across the plains, and in that sound, Sarah heard something she hadn't dared to hope for, the strange comfort of being needed. That night, the fire burned low. Luke sat near it, staring into the embers as if they might hold an answer he'd lost somewhere along the trail. Sarah watched from across the room, the light flickering against his face, the scar near his temple, the shadow beneath his eyes, the quiet pain he carried like a second heartbeat. You're leaving, aren't you? She said at last. He didn't turn. It'd be safer for you if I did. Her breath caught. Safer doesn't always mean better. He looked up then, and in his gaze she saw the war he was fighting between the man he was trying to be and the one the world wouldn't let him forget. I bring trouble, he said. It always finds me. Then let it find us together. He stood slowly, crossing the space between them. The firelight caught the rain still glistening on his coat. Sarah, he said, voice rough, careful, I ain't what you think. I don't need you to be, she whispered. I just need you here. Something inside him broke then quietly, like ice melting after a long winter. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "Go slow," she murmured, the same words she'd once said when tending his wound. "It hurts when you rush." He nodded, eyes softening. "Yeah, it does." Outside, the rain eased, leaving only the wind. Somewhere, beyond the ridge, a coyote cried again, not lonely this time, but calling into the dark as if to say the storm had passed. Luke looked toward the horizon, then back at her. "They'll come again," he said. "Then we'll be ready." The candle flickered, the night closing around them like a promise neither fully understood, and for the first time since the gunfire, the silence didn't feel like danger. It felt like waiting for something neither of them could name yet. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and shining. The air smelled of wet sage and sun, warmed earth. A quiet peace hung over the cabin, fragile, like a thread that could snap if either of them breathed too loud. Sarah stepped outside first, the hem of her skirt brushing against damp grass. The world felt softer somehow. She glanced toward the corral, where Luke was already working, shirt sleeves rolled, bandaged arms stiff but steady as he mended a broken rail. "Shouldn't you rest that shoulder?" she called. He didn't look up. "Shouldn't you still be asleep?" "Sleep's a luxury," she said, crossing the yard. "One I can't seem to afford lately." Luke smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to a man still learning what warmth felt like. "You get used to it." She stood beside him, watching his hands move. The rhythm of his work calmed her. For all the pain and danger that followed him, he carried a kind of steadiness she hadn't felt since before the war took her husband. After a while she asked, "Will it hold?" He tapped the rail, nodding. "It'll hold." Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long. Then she looked away, clearing her throat. "I never learned to shoot." He paused mid-motion. "Your husband never taught you." "I never asked him to. Didn't like guns in the house." Luke leaned against the fence, his gaze drifting toward the open plain. "Guns ain't good or bad. They just tell the truth about a man." She folded her arms. "And what truth do they tell about you?" He hesitated. "That I'm try and not to need one." The wind stirred the grass around them, whispering through the silence that followed. Then Sarah said quietly, "Teach me." Luke turned to her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've spent too long being afraid of what might come. Maybe it's time I stopped waiting for someone else to fight for me." He studied her face, the resolve there, the fear beneath it. "All right," he said finally, "but we go slow." She smiled faintly. "You seem to like saying that." He looked down, almost shy. "It's the only way things last out here." By afternoon, the sky had turned clear and high. Luke set up a few empty cans on a split rail, handed her his revolver. It looked too big in her hands. "Easy," he said. "Don't think about the noise, think about the aim." She exhaled, squinting down the barrel. "It feels heavy." "It should. It's a promise you don't make lightly." He stepped behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath against her hair. His hands came around hers, guiding the grip. "Here," he murmured, "you want your thumb like this." "Yeah, that's it." Her pulse quickened, the warmth of him steady, patient, pressed against her back, and for a moment the world shrank to the sound of his voice. "Now breathe," he said. "Don't fight it. Let it happen." The shot rang out. The can tumbled off the rail. Sarah blinked, half startled, half disbelieving. "I hit it." Luke smiled, soft and proud. "Told you." She turned her head slightly, and he was closer than she expected. Close enough that the words caught in her throat. The air between them changed slower, heavier, the kind of quiet that hummed with something neither of them dared name. "Again?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. They did it again and again until the sun slid low, gold spilling across the prairie. Her hand steadied, her fear turned to focus. But what she couldn't steady was her heart, not with him standing that near. When the last can fell, Luke stepped back. "You learn fast." She turned, meeting his gaze. "I had a good teacher." For a long moment neither moved. The light caught his face, softening the hard edges, the scar at his temple, the tiredness behind his eyes. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. His hand lingered just long enough for her to feel the tremor in his fingers. "Sarah," he said, low, it ain't smart." "Since when did smart keep anyone alive out here?" she whispered. He gave a breath that wasn't quite a laugh, wasn't quite a refusal either. His thumb brushed her jaw, slow, uncertain. Then, before either could think to stop it, he kissed her. It wasn't wild or desperate, it was trembling, careful, like a man afraid of breaking something fragile. When he pulled away, she stayed still, eyes closed, breath uneven. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have." "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't take it back." But he stepped away, the distance between them colder than before. "You don't know what you're asking for, Sarah. I've done things, so have I," she said. "We all have." He turned toward the horizon, fists clenched at his sides. "You deserve better than a man still running from ghosts." Her voice broke slightly. "And you deserve someone who doesn't see a ghost when she looks at you." He didn't answer. The wind carried his silence between them, and by the time the sun dipped below the hills, the warmth they'd found had turned to something raw and aching. That night they said little. The fire burned low again, and the distance between them felt wider than it had in days. But somewhere in that quiet, beneath the fear, beneath the guilt, something fragile still trembled, alive and waiting. The kind of feeling that never really goes away, no matter how far a man tries to ride from it. The next morning rose thin and pale, the kind of light that hides more than it reveals. A restless wind ran across the plains, carrying dust, and with it, unease. Sarah felt it before she saw him, the weight in Luke's silence, the distance in his eyes. He saddled the horses early, saying little. His movements were sharp, practiced the kind of rhythm that comes from a man trying not to think. "Going somewhere?" she asked, leaning against the doorway, arms folded tight against the chill. "Town," he said. "We need flour, coffee too." She nodded, but his voice told her it wasn't just supplies drawing him away. "Should I come?" He shook his head. "Best if you don't. Won't be long." When he rode off, the sound of hooves faded slow, each one heavier than the last. Sarah watched until he was a speck in the distance, swallowed by the horizon. Something inside her twisted, not fear, not yet, but a premonition she couldn't shake. By midday, the quiet began to hum wrong. Even the birds seemed cautious, their songs clipped short. Sarah tried to keep busy sweeping the porch, kneading dough, pretending the world hadn't gone still around her. But her mind kept circling back to the look Luke gave her that morning, half apology, half warning. By afternoon, dust rose again from the east road. Another rider. She stepped out to the porch, heart beating faster. The man dismounted, slow, stranger's face, sharp eyes, and the kind of calm that made danger seem polite. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Whitaker. You alone out here?" Her hand tightened on the railing. "Depends who's asking." He smiled faintly. "Just passing through. Heard tell a man named Luke Carson was seen this way." The name fell heavy between them. Sarah forced her voice steady. "Don't know anyone by that name." Whitaker's smile widened. "That's so." He stepped closer, eyes scanning the yard, the freshly mended fence, the tracks still soft in the dirt. "Funny thing about lies, ma'am. They sound different in the wind." I said I don't know him. He nodded slowly, gaze holding hers a moment too long. Then he said, "If you see him, tell him the bounty on Red Mesa still stands. Some ghosts don't stay buried." He turned his horse and rode off without hurry, confident, certain, as if he'd already found what he came for. Sarah stood frozen, the wind tugging at her shawl. Red Mesa. The words lingered, tasting of blood and smoke. By dusk Luke returned. She met him before he reached the porch. "Someone came," she said. His hand froze on the reins. "Who?" "Whitaker. Said he was looking for you. Said, the bounty still stands." Luke went still, too still. "Sarah," he said quietly. "What else did he say?" "Red Mesa." She hesitated. "What happened there?" He looked past her, toward the dying sun. "Nothing worth remembering." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It ain't?" The silence between them stretched thin. Then she said, "You told me you left that life behind. I tried. Then why is it still chasing you?" He met her eyes finally, and for a heartbeat she saw it, the guilt, the grief, the memory of something he couldn't wash clean. "You don't want to know what I've done, Sarah." Her voice shook. "You think I haven't seen what men can do. I buried one because of it." He stepped back, jaw tight. "I killed men who didn't deserve it. That's the truth. I did it for money, for pride, for nothing worth the blood it cost." Sarah's breath caught. "And now I'm trying to make sure you don't end up paying for it." She took a step toward him. "You can't protect me by vanishing. Watch me," he said, turning away. She reached for his arm. "Luke," he stopped her hand gently, his touch warm but final. "If I stay, he'll come back with more. They'll burn this place to the ground to drag me out." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then let them come. I'm not afraid anymore." His voice broke then, low and rough. "You should be, because every man I've cared for, every soul that's trusted me, ended up in the ground." She stared at him, her heart breaking in slow motion. "Don't make me another ghost in your story." He looked at her, really looked, and something in his face faltered. But the resolve was stronger. By the time dawn touched the window, his bed was empty, his coat, his rifle gone. Sarah stepped onto the porch, bare feet cold against the boards. The horizon stretched wide and merciless, the wind carrying only one truth. He'd left to protect her from a past he couldn't kill. And as the first light broke across the plains, she whispered his name, not in anger, not in despair, but in something quieter. A plea the wind swallowed whole. The days that followed were hollow. The wind still crossed the plains, whispering through the grass, but the sound of it had changed. Without Luke, the silence pressed heavier against the cabin walls, the kind that made every creak sound like a memory. Sarah tried to fill the emptiness with work. She mended the fence again, though it didn't need it. She baked bread no one would eat. At night, she left the lamp burning longer than she should have, just in case he came back and saw the light. But he didn't. Each sunrise brought only more quiet, more sky. And beneath it all, a question she could no longer ignore. Had she believed in a man who never really meant to stay? By the fifth day, the storm inside her had grown too strong to ignore. She saddled her horse before dawn, the air cold enough to bite. The horizon stretched wide and gray, a line between what she knew and what she couldn't live without knowing. The trail to Black Hollow wound through the low hills, where the earth still carried the scent of the last rain. Her mind replayed every word he'd spoken before leaving every haft, truth that sounded like protection. When she reached town, the streets were quiet. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, the saloon lanterns dim from the night before. She tied her horse outside and stepped into the general store. The man behind the counter looked up, blinking. "Morning, Mrs. Bennett. You lookin' for something?" "Coffee," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "And maybe a name," he frowned. "A name? Luke Carson." The shopkeeper's face tightened. "You don't want to be asking about him, ma'am. Ain't a name that sits easy in this town." Sarah's voice steadied. "Tell me anyway." The man sighed, lowering his gaze. "Years back, Red Mesa. They say he rode with the Phelps gang bounty men turned killers. Job went wrong. Whole settlement burned. Carson walked out alone. Her stomach turned cold. They said he killed them. They said he killed everyone." Sarah gripped the edge of the counter, fighting to breathe. "That can't be right. He's not that man anymore." The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. "Maybe not, but the world don't forget easy." Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering dust through the street. Sarah left without another word. She found herself walking without direction past the church, the livery, down toward the edge of town where the land opened wide again. Her heart ached with every step. When she reached the ridge overlooking the valley, she saw him. Luke sat beside a dying fire, hat low, horse grazing nearby. He looked smaller somehow, not in size but in spirit, like a man finally caught by his own shadow. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, the distance between them stretching like the years he'd tried to forget. He noticed her and froze. "Sarah, you weren't planning on saying goodbye?" she asked. He rose slowly, dusting off his hands, didn't think there was much to say. "Then let me," she said, voice trembling. "You think leaving keeps me safe. You think carrying guilt makes you noble, but all you're doing is breaking what little good is left in you." He stared at her, eyes dark, unreadable. "You don't understand what I've done." "Then tell me." He looked away. There was a bounty. Family caught in the crossfire. I pulled the trigger before I knew what was behind the door. The words hit her like cold rain. "A woman," he said, voice low, "and a boy. I buried them myself. That's Red Mesa. That's what you've been sleeping next to." Sarah's throat closed. The wind stung her eyes, but not from dust. "And you've punished yourself every day since." He didn't deny it. "Some debts can't be paid." "Then stop trying to die for them," she whispered. "Start living different." He gave a hollow laugh. "You don't just decide to be forgiven, Sarah. You either are or you ain't." She stepped closer, until only the wind separated them. "I don't forgive you because of what you did. I forgive you because you're still trying not to do it again." Luke's hands trembled at his sides. "You shouldn't." "Maybe," she said softly, "but I will anyway." For a long moment, neither moved. Then she took his hand, the same way she had the night he almost bled out, gentle, certain. He looked at her, eyes wet with something he couldn't name. "You'd still have me after that." "I already do," she whispered. "Even when you're gone." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and smoke the past passing by. He closed his eyes, the fight in him breaking apart. When he opened them again, he looked like a man who wanted to stay, even if he didn't know how. "I don't know where to go from here," he said. "Then don't go anywhere," she answered. "Not tonight." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since the gunfire, the air between them felt quiet again, not from emptiness, but from understanding. As the sun bled out behind the hills, Luke reached for her hand once more. It wasn't a promise yet, just a touch, trembling, unsure, alive. The distance between them was still there, but it was shrinking. And somewhere, carried by the evening wind, forgiveness began to sound a little like hope. The dawn came slow, spilling light across the hills like honey poured over the land. The fire Luke had built the night before was nothing but a scatter of gray ash now, and the air carried that thin chill that comes before heat. Sarah was already awake. She stood near her horse, tightening the reins, her face turned east. She looked steadier than she felt. Luke stirred behind her. "You heading somewhere?" She didn't turn. "Back home, my home, the one you helped me keep." He rose, brushing the dust off his coat. "You don't have to ride alone." She looked over her shoulder. "You don't have to keep running." The words sat heavy between them, simple and final. For a long moment, Luke said nothing. Then he crossed to his horse, slid a hand along its neck, and met her eyes. "You sure you want me there, Sarah? Folks'll talk. They always do." "Let them," she said quietly. "I've lived through worse than gossip." He smiled faintly, that worn, tired smile she'd come to know. "That you have." They rode side by side as the sun lifted higher, the wind pulling at their coats. The land spread wide ahead of them, open, golden, forgiving. Neither spoke much, but it wasn't silence born of distance anymore. It was the kind that settles between two souls who have already said the hard things. By noon, they reached the valley where the cabin stood. Smoke still rose from the chimney, faint, steady. Sarah slowed her horse. "This place," Luke said softly, "it's quiet. Feels like it's holding its breath." She dismounted, boots crunching on the dry grass. "That's because it's waiting, same as I was." He tied his horse beside hers and followed her to the porch. The boards creaked under their weight, familiar, almost comforting. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and the faint trace of bread gone stale. Luke took off his hat and set it on the table. For a man who'd lived out of saddlebags and shadows, it felt like stepping into another world. Sarah moved to the stove, poured water into a kettle. You ever think about staying anywhere before? He gave a low chuckle. Plenty of times. Never thought anyone'd want me to. I do. Her words landed soft but sure. She didn't flinch, didn't blush, she just said it, like it was the truth it was. Luke's gaze dropped to the floor. You don't owe me that, Sarah. It's not about owing, it's about choosing. The kettle began to hiss, a slow rising sound that filled the small space. I buried a lot of things in that graveyard, she said quietly. My husband, my peace, my fear. I don't want to bury anything else, Luke. Not if it's still breathing. He stepped closer, voice low. And what if I don't know how to stay? Then learn, she whispered. The same way I learned to live again. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering a moment longer than it should. You make it sound easy. It isn't, she said, eyes steady. But nothing worth keeping ever is. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the grass, the promise of another storm. Luke turned toward the window. There's a calm before every fight, he murmured. You expecting one? She asked. He nodded slowly. A man like me don't get to walk away clean. There's always someone looking to settle old debts. Sarah set 2 cups on the table. Then we'll face it when it comes. He looked at her, a flicker of warmth in his eyes, not quite peace, but close. For the first time, Luke Carson let himself sit still. No plans, no escape, just the sound of the kettle and a woman who refused to let him vanish. They drank their coffee in quiet, the world outside shifting from gold to gray. When the thunder cracked in the distance, neither of them moved. The storm was coming again, not from the sky this time, but from the trail. And as the wind rattled the windows, Luke's hand found the revolver resting near his chair. Sarah looked at him, unafraid. Whatever's coming, she said, we face it together. He nodded once, slow and certain. Outside, lightning split the horizon, a warning, a promise, and a beginning all at once. By sundown, the sky had turned the color of rust and bruised purple, that kind of light that makes the world hold its breath. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the air tasted like it would. Luke sat by the window, gun resting on the table, cleaning it out of habit more than need. Sarah moved quietly behind him, gathering the shutters, steady as always. The small cabin seemed to hum with unease. Who is it? She asked finally. He didn't look up. Name's Cade Mercer. Rode with Phelps back in the old days. After Red Mesa went wrong, he swore he'd finish what was started. Been tracking me near 6 years now. Sarah tied the shutters closed and faced him. You think he's coming here? He met her gaze. No, I know he is. Outside, thunder rolled low, close enough to make the horses whinny in the barn. Sarah crossed her arms. Then you're not meeting him alone. He shook his head. Ain't your fight. It became mine the second you stepped into my yard. For a long moment neither spoke. Rain began to fall slow, heavy, deliberate. Luke holstered his gun and stood. He won't come by day. Men like Mercer wait for dark. Fear's worth more when you can't see it. Sarah took a breath. Then we'll light the lamps. He looked at her, a hint of something almost like pride. You don't scare easy, do you? She gave a faint smile. Not anymore. As night settled, they readied the place. Luke checked the doors, the rifle, the lines of sight through the windows. Sarah brought out a lantern and set it in the center of the table, steady flame against the dark. The minutes crawled. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind felt louder. Then came the first sound, hooves, slow and deliberate, crunching through wet gravel. Luke's jaw tightened. He's here. Sarah's hand found the rifle. Then let's finish it. The hooves stopped just outside the fence. A voice called out deep, rasping, too calm. Carson, you've been a long time common. Luke stepped to the doorway, rain glinting off the brim of his hat. Mercer. The man on the horse was broad, shouldered, face lined from years of sun and sin. His coat was black, soaked through, and his eyes carried that mean glint of someone who'd lived too long on hate. "Wasn't sure I'd find you hidden behind a widow," Mercer said. "Didn't seem your style." Luke's voice stayed low. "You're standin' on her land. Watch your mouth." Mercer grinned. "Always the gentleman. You gonna invite me in or shoot me where I sit?" Sarah's voice cut through from behind Luke. "You've got no business here. Take your grudge and ride out." Mercer turned his gaze toward her. "And who might you be?" "The reason he's still alive," she said evenly. Mercer laughed a cold, hollow sound. "Well, ain't that sweet? Maybe I'll bury you beside him when I'm done." That was the last word he managed before Luke's revolver fired. The bullet hit the post beside Mercer's boot, close enough to send his horse rearing. "Next one won't miss," Luke said. Mercer steadied his mount, eyes narrowing. "Still the same man who burned Red Mesa. Thought maybe guilt might have softened you." Luke's jaw tightened. "That was never justice. That was a mistake I live with every damn day." Mercer's tone sharpened, then die with it. He swung from his saddle, firing before his boots hit mud. The shot shattered the doorframe. Luke ducked back, returning fire, the crack of it echoing across the fields. Sarah grabbed the rifle, taking position by the window. She fired once, and the second outlaw fell from the shadows near the barn, one of Mercer's men she hadn't seen before. "Two more," Luke called. Rain lashed against the walls. Bullets tore through the boards, splintering wood. Sarah reloaded fast, her hands steady despite the noise. Mercer's voice cut through the chaos. "You can't win this, Carson. You don't get redemption, you get an ending." Luke fired again. "Then let's find out which one it is." The fight burned hot and short. One outlaw dropped by the fence. Another ran for his horse and didn't get far. When the thunder finally drowned the last gunshot, Mercer was the only one left. He limped forward, blood on his sleeve, revolver still shaking in his hand. "Go on, Carson," he rasped. "Finish it." Luke stepped out into the rain, weapon steady. For a heartbeat he almost did. Then he lowered the gun. "No," he said, "I'm done killing ghosts." Mercer's laugh was ragged. "You think that makes you clean?" Luke shook his head. "No, but it makes me better than I was." Sarah appeared behind him, her rifle still raised, her face unreadable. Mercer looked at her, sneered, and spat blood. "You're a fool for tacking him in." She held his gaze. "Maybe, but fools live longer than cowards." Mercer's strength gave out then. He dropped to his knees, then fell forward into the mud. The rain kept falling, washing away the blood as if the earth itself was tired of it. Luke stood there a long while, watching the life leave the man who'd chased him through 6 years of guilt. Sarah stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "It's over," she said softly. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "No, it's just different now." They turned back toward the cabin, soaked and silent. The storm broke behind them, lightning chasing the last of the night away. Inside, the lantern still burned small, steady, stubborn. Luke looked at it for a long moment. "That light's still going," he said quietly. Sarah poured him a cup of coffee, her hands shaking just slightly. "So are we." He took the cup, meeting her gaze. For once, he didn't look like a man running. Outside, the rain began to fade, and for the first time, the ghosts stayed quiet. The storm had passed by morning, but the world still trembled from its memory. Smoke drifted from the smoldering wreckage of the fight, the smell of gunpowder, wet earth, and loss lingering heavy in the air. Luke carried Sarah inside, her breath shallow, her side bleeding from the bullet meant for him. She tried to speak, but he hushed her softly. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Save your strength." He laid her down on the bed, his hands trembling as he tore open a bandage. The wound was deep but clean, high enough to miss the lung, low enough to make her wince when she breathed. "You shouldn't have come out there," he whispered. "You should have stayed inside." Her eyes fluttered open. "You'd be dead if I did." He swallowed hard, pressing the cloth against her skin. Blood seeped through his fingers, hot and slick. The sight of it, her blood, undid something inside him. He'd spent years watching death come easy, but this was different. This was unbearable. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice barely holding, "stay with me." Her hand found his wrist, weak but steady. "I'm not going anywhere." By afternoon, the worst of the bleeding had stopped. The light through the cabin window turned gold, soft and unsteady. Luke sat beside her, bandage-stained, shirt torn, eyes hollow with worry. She stirred, whispering, "You keep pacing. Sit down before the floor gives out." He tried to smile, but it faltered. "Can't rest, not till I know you're all right." Her gaze softened. "Then you'll be up all night." For a long while, silence filled the room, broken only by the fire crackling low. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of what had been risked, and what might yet be lost. When he finally spoke again, it came out rough, unsure. "You took that shot for me." She looked at him, eyes clear despite the pain. "You've taken enough for both of us." He bowed his head, voice shaking. "I ain't worth it." "Don't say that. It's the truth." Her hand reached for his, fingers brushing against the calloused skin of his palm. "Luke," she said softly, "we don't get to choose who we save. We just do it. That's what makes it mean something." He closed his hand around hers, afraid to grip too tightly. "You talk like someone who ain't scared of dying." "I'm not," she whispered. "I'm scared of you carrying it alone." The fire dimmed to embers. Luke stared into it for a long time, the flicker painting his face in light and shadow. When he spoke again, it was barely above a breath. "I don't know how to be with someone after what I've done. Then learn slow," she said. "Go slow. It hurts when you don't." The words struck him deeper than any bullet could have. He turned to her, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Go slow," he repeated like a vow. She smiled faintly. "You'll get there." He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch hesitant, careful, like a man learning how to hold something fragile for the first time. A night deepened around them. The wind outside had softened, the prairie stretching quiet beneath the stars. Luke sat by her side until her breathing evened out, until the tension in his chest eased enough for him to breathe, too. At dawn he stepped outside. The air was cold, clean. The land stretched endless and golden, washed clean of blood and dust. He looked toward the horizon, toward the life he thought he'd lost, now waiting to begin again. Behind him, Sarah stirred in her sleep, the faintest smile touching her lips. Luke turned back to her and whispered, as if the wind might carry it, "You saved me too." Then he closed the door softly and watched the sunrise break over the plains. It was the first morning in years that didn't taste like regret, just hope, slow, fragile, and real. The morning light broke sharp across the valley, thin, silver, untrusting, the kind of light that made scars show clearer. Luke stood by the window, watching the world wake slow. Sarah slept behind him, breath shallow but steady, her wound healing in silence. He should have felt peace. He didn't. Somewhere beyond those distant hills, vengeance was still moving, slower now, maybe, but certain as the wind that swept through the grass. Mercer had fallen, but men like him never rode alone. Luke knew it, the way he knew how to draw a gun, instinct deep in the bone. He poured a cup of coffee, hands trembling. The smell of smoke and iron clung to him like memory. Behind him, Sarah stirred. "You're thinking too loud," she murmured. He turned, the ghost of a smile passing over his face. "Can't seem to stop." She pushed herself up on one elbow. "You did what you had to. It's done." He shook his head. "Not yet." Her eyes narrowed, catching the weight in his tone. "Luke, what are you fixin' to do?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "End it, for good." Sarah's voice trembled. "You don't owe that to anyone." He stepped closer, brushing her hair from her face with a gentleness that contradicted the words that followed. "I owe it to you. They won't stop. Not till I make sure they can't. Her hand caught his wrist, holding it tight. If you ride out there, you won't come back. He looked down, the fight in him softening. I'll come back, I promise. She searched his face, seeing the truth beneath the promise. You're a terrible liar. He almost smiled. Then you know me well. By dusk, he was gone. The prairie stretched before him wide, empty, endless. The sun sank red behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruises. Luke rode hard, the sound of hooves like a heartbeat he couldn't quiet. He followed the trail Mercer's men had come from deep into the canyon country, where the air turned dry and mean. At the mouth of the gorge, the tracks split, then gathered again near a rocky rise. Smoke curled faintly from a camp below 3 horses, 2 men, 1 fire burning low. Luke dismounted, checked his revolver, and started down on foot. Each step echoed with old ghosts, Red Mesa, the faces he couldn't forget. The boy he'd been when he first drew a gun for money. He'd thought the blood he spilled then could be forgotten. He'd been wrong. Now he meant to pay the debt in full. The first man never saw him coming. One silent shot dropped him beside the fire. The second turned, firing wild, the bullet grazing Luke's shoulder. Luke fired back once clean, final. The canyon went still, but the silence didn't bring peace. Only the hollow thrum of what he'd become again. He stood there a long while, gun still warm in his hand. Then he holstered it, looking up at the stars beginning to pierce the sky. When he rode back, the moon was high. The prairie gleamed silver, quiet as prayer. Sarah waited by the fence, wrapped in a shawl, pale but standing. When she saw him, she exhaled a breath she'd been holding since sundown. You said you'd come back, she whispered. He dismounted, slow, eyes tired but alive. I did. She stepped closer, studying him, the blood, the dust, the look of a man who'd met his own shadow and survived it. Did you kill them all? She asked. He nodded once. Yeah. And how do you feel? He hesitated. Empty. Sarah's gaze softened. That's not emptiness, Luke. That's the space where something better can grow. He reached out, brushing his thumb along her cheek. You still believe that? I have to. He swallowed hard. I laid my gun down when it was done, left it there in the dirt. Her breath caught. For good. For good, he said. A man can't love and keep killin', not both. She stepped into him then, the air between them finally still. He held her, careful at first, then tighter when she didn't let go. The wind changed softer now, carrying the scent of rain and cedar. For a long time, they just stood there, 2 souls too tired to speak, hearts beating in the same quiet rhythm. Then Sarah whispered against his chest, You came back to me. Luke rested his chin against her hair. There was nowhere else worth going. In the distance, thunder murmured, far away this time, not a warning, but a memory fading into the horizon. The prairie exhaled, the night deepened, and the ghosts at last went quiet. Dawn came slow and golden, rolling over the plains like forgiveness itself. The storm was gone. The smoke from the fight had vanished into the far hills. Only silence remained, heavy, whole, and clean. Sarah stood outside the cabin, a folded piece of parchment in her hands, the last bounty poster she'd found. Luke Carson, wanted dead or alive. The paper had yellowed, the ink smudged by rain, but his face still stared back, younger, harder, like a ghost she no longer recognized. Luke stepped out behind her, his coat draped loose around his shoulders, eyes still marked with the weight of too many nights awake. She held the poster out to him. You left your gun. Thought you might want to finish this too. He looked at it a long time, then he took the paper, knelt beside the fire pit, and struck a match. The flame caught quick, bright, hungry. The face on the poster curled at the edges, blackened, then folded in on itself until nothing was left but drifting ash. Sarah watched it rise, the smoke twining up toward the pale morning sky. Feels strange, she whispered. Watching a whole life burn away. Luke stared into the ashes, his voice low. It ain't the life I want remembered. She turned to him, sunlight cutting across her face. Then what do you want remembered? He took a long breath. That I tried to make something right. even if it took me too damn long to start. The fire died down, the smoke faded into air. Sarah's hand found his not out of pity, not out of need, but out of something steadier. Then let that be enough. He looked at her, and for the first time there was no flinch, no distance. Just quiet acceptance, the kind that takes root when running finally ends. By noon, they buried what was left of the past. Luke stacked the last of the spent shells, buried them beneath a stone by the fence line. Sarah placed the burned scraps beside them. When it was done, they stood side by side, the wind tugging at her hair, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. "You think they'll come again?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not for me. Not anymore." "Then what now?" He looked across the land, the fields bruised with new green after rain, the creek glinting in the distance. "We build," he said softly. "We start where the world left off." Sarah smiled faintly. "You ever built a home before, Luke?" He shook his head. "No, but I figure it can't be harder than burying the man I used to be." She laughed quietly, the sound small, real, and almost shy. As the sun climbed, Luke fetched a hammer, mended the porch rail where a bullet had split the wood. Sarah swept the floor, hummed under her breath, the tune light as the wind. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It no longer carried grief, only peace. By evening, the cabin looked less like a shelter and more like a home, a place where two worn souls might rest without looking over their shoulders. Luke leaned against the doorframe, watching the horizon fade to amber. "Never thought I'd see this day," he said. Sarah set the broom aside and came to stand beside him. "That's the thing about hope," she murmured. "It don't ask permission to show up." He turned to her, the sunset in his eyes. "You make me believe that. You make it possible." He took her hand then, slow and certain. The prairie wind blew soft through the tall grass, carrying away the scent of gunpowder and fear, leaving only the clean smell of rain, soaked earth and cedar smoke. Behind them, the ashes cooled to gray, the last trace of a life left behind. Ahead of them, the world stretched wide and unwritten. Luke glanced at her, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "Feels lighter," he said. Sarah nodded. "That's because it is." The wind shifted east, warm and gentle, as if the land itself had forgiven them both. And for the first time in a long time, they didn't turn back. The morning broke gentle and wide, spilling gold across the land like a promise finally kept. The air carried the scent of wet sage and the distant sound of river water rolling over stone. For the first time in months, Sarah woke without fear clawing at her chest. She stepped out onto the porch barefoot, her dress brushing against the worn boards. The world looked new, the kind of new that comes after too much hurt, when everything feels borrowed and fragile. Luke was already out by the corral, sleeves rolled up, feeding the horses. His movements were slow, easy, unguarded, a man at peace with the silence he'd once run from. She watched him a while before speaking. "You work like a man who finally stopped running." He glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe I did." Sarah crossed her arms, leaning on the post. "You plan on telling me where you're going next?" He tossed a handful of hay into the trough. "Ain't going nowhere, not unless you're comin' too." Her breath caught not from surprise, but from the truth in his tone. "You sure about that, Luke Carson? Stayin' means fassin' what's left." He walked closer, boots scuffing the dirt, stopping just short of her. "Already did, faced it, buried it, burned what needed burnin'. What's left is this." He gestured toward her, toward the cabin, toward the soft line of smoke curling from the chimney. "And I reckon that's enough." Sarah looked at him a long moment, then nodded once. "Then, I guess we best learn how to live again." The words hung easy in the air, not a promise, not a plea, just truth. Luke stepped past her into the cabin, poured 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one. "Ain't the best brew," he said, "but it's hot." She took it, their fingers brushing for half a second. Hot'll do just fine. They drank in silence, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Outside, the prairie stretched for miles wild, endless, forgiving. Luke set his cup down, watching the horizon. "I been thinkin'," he said finally. "Dangerous habit." She teased softly. He chuckled. "Maybe, but maybe it's time to put down roots. Build something that lasts." Sarah looked out where the morning light kissed the hills. "What would you build, Luke?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "A place that don't need garden. A home that don't remember pain." She studied him, then smiled slow and warm. "Then I'll help you build it." He nodded once, like a man sealing a vow. By midday, they worked side by side repairing fences, planting seed where the ground had healed from fire. Every nail, every handful of earth, was a step toward something whole. When the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch again. The world glowed copper, soft and tired. Sarah leaned back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feels like the land's breathin' again." Luke looked at her, the light catching in her hair, the quiet peace in her face, and for the first time, he let himself believe it could last. "Yeah," he said, "so are we." The prairie wind stirred around them, carrying the faint call of a lark and the sweet scent of fresh rain. And for the first time since the blood, the gunfire, and the loss, neither one of them felt alone. The peace didn't last long. Out on the horizon, just past the line where the land met the sky, 3 riders appeared small at first, then growing clear through the shimmer of heat and dust. Luke saw them first. He set his hammer down slow, the sound of metal against wood sharp in the quiet morning. His jaw tightened, the way it used to before a fight. Sarah followed his gaze, her breath catching. "You know him?" "Not yet," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "But I got a feeling they know me." The riders came steady, not fast, not the kind that came for blood, but the kind that carried words heavy as bullets. Sarah stepped closer to him. "Thought you said it was over." "So did I," Luke muttered. But trouble don't much care what a man believes. By the time the riders reached the fence line, the wind had picked up. Dust swirled around their horses' hooves. The man in front pulled down his bandana, revealing a lined, sun-bitten face. "Marshal Crane." "Luke Carson," the marshal called out. "Heard tell you were dead." Luke's voice stayed even. "You heard wrong." Crane dismounted slow, every move deliberate. "Got word from Abilene. Some men back there ain't too happy. Seems a bounty never got cleared." Luke's eyes darkened. "That bounty's gone, burned." The marshal's gaze shifted to Sarah, then back to Luke. "Maybe so, but papers don't burn as clean as a man hopes. You know how the law works." Sarah stepped forward. "He's done with all that, Marshal. You see it plain as I do." Crane's expression softened, but only a little. "Ma'am, I don't doubt he's tryin', but there's folks out there who only see the man he was." Luke's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Then let him come look for him. They won't find him here." Crane sighed, the kind that comes from too many years chasing ghosts. "Wish it were that simple, Luke. Words travelin'. If I were you, I'd keep an eye on the road. Some deaths don't die easy." With that, he mounted up again, tipped his hat to Sarah, and rode off, the others following behind in a trail of dust. Silence fell heavy once more. Sarah turned to him. "You think they'll come?" Luke stared after the marshal until the riders vanished into heat. "Yeah," he said quietly, "they'll come." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then we'll be ready." He looked at her, something fierce and certain in his eyes. "No, Sarah. I'm done letting my past bleed into your peace. If they come, they'll find me, not you." She shook her head, her tone low but strong. "We stand together, Luke. I ain't hidden while you face ghosts alone." He wanted to argue, but her gaze didn't waver. The same strength that once held a dying man's hand now held his heart still. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Together then." The wind rose, carrying the sound of a storm rolling in from the west, the kind that promised change. Luke glanced at the darkening horizon, the old fire in his eyes tempered by something new purpose. "Let him come," he said, almost to himself. "This time, I ain't the one running." Sarah stepped beside him, her hand finding his. "No," she said, "you're the one worth staying for." And as thunder cracked in the distance, both of them stood facing the storm side by side, unflinching, ready to meet whatever the past still owed. By the time the last frost melted from the prairie grass, months had passed since the marshal's warning. No riders had come. No shadows crossed their door. Only the slow rhythm of rebuilding hammer, soil, laughter, and silence filled their days. Luke fixed the porch rail where the wind had split it, while Sarah knelt in the garden, planting the season's first seeds. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, hands dark with earth. Each motion she made was careful, tender, as though she believed the soil could remember kindness. When he looked at her, the weight in his chest felt lighter, like some long-held burden was finally learning to rest. He hadn't realized how much peace could sound like the clink of her trowel or the sigh of her breath when she stood to stretch. "The ground's soft this year," she said, brushing hair from her cheek. "Feels alive again." Luke leaned his shoulder against the post. "Ain't the only thing that feels alive." She glanced up at him, smiling faintly. "You talking about me or yourself?" He half smiled, "Guess both." A warm wind came rolling from the south, not sharp like winter, not heavy like storm winds, but soft and steady, the kind that carried the scent of grass and change. Sarah closed her eyes and lifted her face to it. "Smells like summer's common early." "Yeah," Luke said, watching the horizon. "It does." By late afternoon, the world had turned gold. The prairie shimmered like a sea of light, and their small home stood at its heart, a rough cabin made honest by sweat and time. Sarah hung the wash while Luke stacked firewood by the wall. Every small act between them felt like something sacred, quiet, necessary, real. When the sun began to sink, she walked toward him, barefoot in the cool grass. The air hummed with crickets and the low call of distant birds. "Luke," she said softly, "it's been a long time since the world felt still." He looked at her, his voice low. "Still ain't safe, Sarah, but it's something close." She smiled, taking his hand. "Close is enough." They stood that way for a while, the light slipping from gold to amber. Then, without a word, she turned toward the open field and stepped into it. "Come with me," she said. He hesitated. "Where?" "Nowhere," she whispered, her eyes bright. "Just here." He followed her boots, sinking into soft ground. When they reached the clearing, she stopped and turned, the breeze tugging at her hair. Then she laughed a sound light as rain and took his hands, guiding him gently, swaying in time with the wind. He blinked, startled. "You're dancin', maybe." He chuckled low. "Ain't no music." "There is," she said, pressing her palm to his chest. "Right here." The words quieted him. For a long moment, they just moved her head, resting against him, his hand at her back, the prairie stretching endless all around. The world seemed to breathe with them. The wind turned warm, full of promise instead of warning. For the first time in years, Luke Carson forgot to look over his shoulder. When the last light faded and the first stars showed, they stopped, breathless, holding on to one another, as though the night itself might carry them away. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Feels like we finally outran it." Luke brushed his thumb along her jaw, eyes steady on hers. "No," he said, "we didn't outrun it. We just stopped running." And somewhere in the stillness, between the heartbeat of the land and the sigh of the wind, both of them knew the past had turned to dust behind them, and the future was quietly, finally, theirs. The sun rose slow that morning, spilling soft light over the prairie like a blessing. Dew clung to every blade of grass, turning the field silver for a breath before the warmth melted it away. Sarah saddled the horses while Luke packed a small canvas bag, flour, salt, coffee, a few tools for trade. It was a quiet ritual, the kind they had built together. No hurry, no shadows, just the steady rhythm of a life earned, not given. When he stepped outside, the air smelled of lilac and dust. Sarah was already astride her mare, her dress tucked neatly beneath her, her hat tilted low against the light. She looked back at him and smiled, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "You comin', or do I have to fetch you?" she teased. Luke grinned faintly and swung into the saddle. "I've learned not to keep you waitin', Mrs. Bennett." She rolled her eyes, though her cheeks flushed. "You still call me that?" He leaned closer, his voice quiet. "Habit I ain't ready to break." They started toward town at an easy pace, hooves thudding soft against the earth. The prairie stretched out before them, green now, alive again. Hawks circled in the distance, and somewhere a creek murmured beneath cottonwoods. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't the heavy kind it used to be. It was full, like a song played slow and true. Sarah glanced over, her hair catching the light. "Feels strange, don't it? Ridden without running." Luke nodded. "Strange, good kind of strange." They passed the old ridge where the sky always seemed wider. From there, the trail dipped toward Black Hollow, the same town where grief had once swallowed her whole. Now it looked small, harmless even, tucked beneath the shadow of the hills. She reached across the narrow space between their horses and touched his hand. Her voice was steady, full of the quiet certainty that only comes after loss. "You kept your word," she said. "Pain never touched me again." Luke looked at her for a long moment, the woman who'd buried her sorrow, fought for her peace, and taught him how to live without a gun in his hand. Then he smiled, soft and sure. "Not while I'm breathin'," he said. The wind lifted, carrying their laughter over the plains. As they rode on, the prairie opened before them, golden, endless, forgiving. Behind them, the cabin stood small but unbroken, smoke curling from its chimney. Ahead, the horizon glowed wide and blue, the kind of sky that promised forever without saying a word. They rode easy, side by side, the world unspooling slow beneath their horses' steps. No ghosts, no debts, just the sound of hooves, the rustle of wind, and the faint beat of two hearts that had finally found their way home. And as the sun climbed higher, Luke tipped his hat, eyes fixed on the far line of the land. "Let's ride, Sarah," he said. "Day's waitin'." She smiled, heel nudging her horse forward. "Then let's not keep it." The wind turned warm again, and the prairie carried them onward, gentle and endless, into the quiet forever they'd both been searching for.